Hello, welcome to AT&T Threat Track for June 14th, 2016. This program provides network security highlights, discussion, and countermeasures for cyber threats. Today we're joined by Joe Harton. Welcome, Joe.
All right.
Joe, you work a lot on our threat analysis platform. Any big developments lately?
We're just trying to keep up with the threats that are out there. They never stop coming, so we need to just grow and get ready to take a look at everything that's out there.
Keeps getting bigger.
Oh yeah, definitely.
All right, so I think our jobs are secure for a while.
Hopefully.
Okay. We have John Hogaboom here.
How you doing?
Welcome, John. Back from vacation?
Back from vacation, ready to do some security stuff.
All right,
again.
glad to have you here. And online we have John Markley. Welcome, John. It's been a while.
Yep, thank you for having me back again.
All right, and I'm Brian Rexroad, and let's get into the first story here. And we'll go to you, Joe. Okay. And I guess a lot of virtualization activities going on, across the industry, and so a lot of attention being paid to how that virtualization is working.
Yeah, so this was an interesting piece that came out in some of the publications from the Bitdefender antivirus company. Mm-hmm. They were doing some research on, they were trying to research malicious outbound activity, and they sort of stumbled upon a method for exploiting the cloud, really. What they found is that if you can get at the hypervisor, you can extract the TLS keys. So it's not really an exploit of TLS, it's more a way to grab the keys. Mm-hmm. So you have to have access to the hypervisor. So this is it's kind of a wiretap, a snooping, eavesdropping, whatever you want to call it. It's a way to, basically how the attack works is if you dump the memory while the TLS handshake is going on, you can extract the keys out of the mem dump. It's pretty advanced way to get at those keys, but they did track it down, and some of the dangerous byproducts here is that this can decrypt all communications between the tenant and end users, and there's really not much of a footprint here, so there's no way to tell how long the communications have been decrypted, and it's really, you have to sort of look at the size of the mem dumps in order to really diagnose that this has happened. So it's really an interesting and kind of dangerous thing. It was published by Bitdefender at a conference, the Hack in the Box conference in Amsterdam. It does only work with the hypervisor, so it's more at the provider level. So in the public clouds like Amazon, Google, DigitalOcean, Microsoft. So if you can prevent access to the hypervisor, you can be sure this isn't happening. But if you don't own the hardware, if you don't own the metal, you're not really sure that this isn't going on in your cloud. So.
Well, actually, that's a very good point. So there are a lot of good advantages from a security standpoint in the cloud environment, in the sense that it provides a lot of structure to help manage systems, their updates, a lot of consistency. It also allows a lot of, aside from security, a lot of better efficiency in terms of using systems. But I guess, excuse me, as you point out, the security of the tenants really depends on the security of the hypervisor, and this is a case where, in a sense, you almost can think of the bare metal as the hypervisor in this case, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's really a control factor. When you're in the cloud, you're giving up a little bit of control. Somebody else is in control of your security, of your application to some degree, and it's this is the type of thing that you have to be wary of. When you're going into the cloud, is that you have to make sure the right security is in place, and even if it is in place, you have to make sure your cloud provider, no longer is it exclusively your responsibility to protect your assets. It's now you and your cloud provider. So it's a control trade-off.
Yeah, I mean, control. One person's control is another person's benefits, right?
Yeah,
so
overhead, right?
If you're not concerned about, if you really want to focus on your application, and don't really want to be concerned about managing the system itself and the underlying, support of that cloud infrastructure, it becomes a service for them. So
right, yeah, it's definitely a trade-off.
Yep, very good.
I was going to say I think it's interesting how they kind of came across this, because thinking like we do, when you're doing malware analysis, and I think that's probably where this originated from. A lot of times we do malware analysis on virtualized environments, but if the malware is using HTTPS as part of its communication, there's really no way, even when you're on the machine, to really effectively intercept that communication and decrypt it without doing some kind of weird proxying type of thing. So I think this is an interesting technique for malware analysis, which is probably why they invented it, to get right into the hypervisor, sneak in, get the keys, decrypt, so the malware doesn't even know you're in there,
Right.
being able to intercept and view its communications. But then once they came up with that, they said, well, wait a second. Somebody could do this in any virtualized environment,
Right, yeah.
potentially here. So interesting kind of pivot of that technique. But sometimes things that are made for good can often be exploited for bad purposes too. Not saying anybody's doing that, but
Yeah.
that's what their cautionary tale is.
You're
here, I
absolutely
guess,
right. And what's actually surprising to me is how many security issues are discovered by accident.
Yeah, yeah.
Right.
All right, so the next story that I'll go ahead and cover this one here. DeRay McKesson is an activist, and basically what had ended up happening to him, he was the victim of an attack. Attackers gained access to his cell phone account. Now, this wasn't an AT&T account, but ultimately what it came down to is his mobile service provider was social engineered, and they were able to gain access to the account. And I think this is one of the fundamental challenges, that as a service provider, it's the balance between providing friendly customer service, I've got a problem with my service, please help me fix it, versus the, basically providing good security. And, unquestionably, the mobile service provider made a mistake here. So let's put that on the table for the moment. Ultimately, what ended up happening is that the attackers were able to gain access to his phone number, and consequently gain access to his SMS messages. Now, he had what we're going to call two-factor authentication set up on apparently a couple of email accounts as well as his Twitter account. Ultimately, what it came down to is they were able to bypass the two-factor authentication and gain access to those accounts. Now, the question is, if you have two-factor authentication, how did this happen? Well, when we think about two-factor authentication, there are actually two things that are generally associated with two-factor authentication: something you have and something you know. Now, in this case, they're really kind of, I guess, using the notion of having access to SMS as one of those factors, and presumably your password being the password for access to the account being the other factor, something you have and something you know. Now, I think the real definition of two-factor really is something you physically have, a physical thing, not access to a particular account. But we'll let that slide for a moment here. Ultimately, what ends up happening in this particular case is, and I can't speak for the email accounts, but I think there are a lot of accounts that do this. I don't want to pick on Twitter in particular, but in this particular case, Twitter allows you to reset your password exclusively using SMS. So you have the option of having the password sent to you by email or having it sent to you by SMS. And Brian Krebs had pointed out some time ago, as a part of his book, Spam Nation, I think it was actually an addendum to the book, where he points out that your crown jewels are effectively access to your email. That is, almost any account you have anywhere, if somebody gets access to your email, they can get a password reset and have it sent through email. Well, this is a case where you get the choice between SMS or email. In this case, they got access to SMS, were able to reset his password, gain access to the Twitter account, and post, effectively, I guess, some abusive messages. I didn't actually see the messages. But ultimately, what it comes down to is, I think, yes, the mobile service provider made a mistake here. It's very difficult to balance when somebody comes in and says, I need help with my service. But this is a case where two-factor authentication is being misrepresented. It is not two-factor authentication unless you have to have both things in order to gain access to the account. So, and this is just a snapshot of what the Twitter reset is. You have the radio button to choose between a text code that is SMS or an email link, having a link sent through email to regain access to it. And they even give you the last two digits of the phone number so that you can verify that it's going to go to the phone number that you're expecting. So
The question I would have is, on your mobile device you can get like the RSA app for the RSA token. It's a soft, I guess, whatever. And I've never really looked into this myself. Does anybody know is that portable? Like, could you port that to another device, or is it actually physically tied to like the hardware ID of your device, that key?
I don't know for certain. My understanding is that it's actually tied to the device, but ultimately I think it's coming down to the isolation of the app itself is the boundary of security there. So I don't think it's actually proving that you have that mobile device. It's really basically proving that you have that app. But I am not aware of any situations where that's been compromised at this point. But it's it's certainly one of these things that ultimately is going to be put to the test in the long
Yeah, and then
run.
even if you had a smart device and had something else on there that could access what was happening with the RSA app, it could be shuttling off the numbers as they come out. I don't know.
Yeah.
Just thinking out loud, but it seems like it's very hard unless you have one of those little physical tokens that have no access to anything else that just display a number. That's really the only 100% surefire way,
Yep.
I guess.
The least convenient, but probably the most secure. In fact,
Right.
there was a time ago when, and this was many years ago, probably 15, maybe even 20 years ago, IBM started incorporating hardware into their laptops that basically provided some security features, as an isolated hardware component, but it added cost to the devices, and I think ultimately it wasn't competitive perhaps before its time. I think if somebody were to reintroduce something like that, particularly in a mobile device, that basically to have some hardware in the device that's dedicated to providing an authentication capability, maybe a little segment of the display that's dedicated to that function would potentially pay off, and particularly in high risk environments or high security environments, particularly the financial community where they're concerned about those types of things, very sensitive about their devices they purchase and that type of thing. So, we'll have to see as time goes on whether this type of thing it develops a lot better. And I know, there's work that's being done to help tie the actual registration process. The SIM card is very difficult to clone. You actually at least have to gain physical access to it at the very least. So that's a case where there's some good possibility in improving the verifying that you have, that you physically have something. So John Markley, let's go to you. And there were some accusations here. I think those have been swayed a bit, but hopefully you can help us a little bit more to provide some personal assurance.
Yeah, I don't know if I can give you a whole bunch of personal assurance, but I did want to, just mention that there was an accusation or really some research that tried to indicate that, Facebook has a feature where it listens in on your microphone and tries to direct certain content to you based upon contextual, references you might make verbally. The accusation was those verbal cues were being used to direct advertisement to you, so that if you say, hey, I'm going to go get a drink of water, or I'm going to go get a soda, and the next thing you see popped up in Facebook was an ad for Diet Coke, or some other soda that might be out there. So the challenge was from a privacy perspective, is that getting sent to a server somewhere, is it getting stored, what is the whole concern that you might have about somebody listening in on your voice conversation. Facebook has said no. This is not true. This is not a concern. It's solely for that contextual reference, not advertisement. They're not storing it anywhere. They're not relating it to any other content other than what they explicitly tell you. So that has kind of been disproven, and even the researcher who posted it said, well, I was researching this before I got on the news program to talk about it. So maybe it's not, as severe as I thought it was.
I think the main thing is, and it kind of leads to what you were talking about at a different level, but it leads to what you were talking about earlier, Joe, about when you're using a cloud service, you're entrusting that cloud service, and so you really need to have some confidence in the integrity of that service in order to.
And on Facebook, it's what you're sharing, what sort of privacy you're relinquishing just by having a presence on Facebook and posting and showing who you're connected to. That's you're relinquishing a little bit of yourself that way too.
Yeah, and it all comes down to it becomes more and more difficult to understand where the boundaries are of that sharing. So, but to your point, John.
Yeah, so one of the things I wanted to talk about here is that we're always concerned about, and we always tell people, know your permissions apps, right? Know them. So what I wanted to do is actually show how to change permissions. And I'm picking on Facebook a little bit, so I apologize, all my Facebook friends and colleagues out there at Facebook. But
Well, actually, John, it's good to point out this isn't necessarily a Facebook specific thing. There are other things that request access to your microphone, and you want to make sure that, if you're granting access, that it's for a reason and a good reason, and you understand the context of how it gets used.
And then that's exactly, so the shot I have here is actually from one of my personal devices, and it's an Apple iOS device. I did a search in settings for microphone. It popped up the privacy part of the settings. This is a fairly new version of Apple iOS. And you'll notice I have 3 apps that said that they want to use the microphone, that have requested permission. And those 3 apps, I have it turned off. Yay me! But the key there is that those apps are things that we just need to look at. You need to know that when an app is installed, what does it want? And sometimes it's not something you want to give it.
Yep.
And the good thing, at least with here, is I can turn it off. At least this feature, the microphone. And you can kind of do it on Android as well. So Android's a little bit trickier. Starting with Marshmallow or 6.0, you do have an app permissions by app, and you can go in and tweak certain things. And here's another example that I pulled down from another source. It's not my personal device, but it was just that I can go and turn certain things on and off based upon the permissions. And these were permissions that were installed or set up when I installed the app. And so that's the neat thing about Android 6 is that I have this level of granularity. Older versions of Android, not so much. So it is very important, especially on older versions of Android, that you know what you're granting an app when you first install it.
Oh, and keep your devices up to date.
And keep your devices up to date. Yes, sir.
All right, very good.
I was going to mention really quickly that I think last year we covered a very similar story, but not from a voice control. But there's I forget what it's called. It's an over-the-air thing when you're watching television. Advertisements it's inaudible to the human ear, but they'll kind of spit out a little encoded message that your handset can pick up.
Right.
And then I don't know where that goes, but lets certain advertising know some connectivity there to say that this person was watching this television program or saw this ad on TV. And I've never really researched it myself to see how that all works, but I thought that was an interesting, similar kind of privacy issue there.
Yeah, if I remember correctly, that was also somewhat of a conjecture scenario that they didn't really know for certain that was actually taking place, but it was certainly a possibility that it could be, right?
Yeah,
it's like location services are another example. It's like if I'm playing a game on my computer or my phone, does it really need to know that I'm playing such and such a game, that I'm walking through the halls of a mall or I'm walking in a car somewhere? It doesn't need to know that.
Right.
Hopefully, you're not playing a game while you're driving, but still, it's it's those things that you just need to know the permissions.
Right. Absolutely. All right. So, John, let's go to you. And we've been tracking these
we have.
these device malware things for some time now, and you've done some of your own analysis. And there was an article that showed up here, so maybe a little comparison.
Yeah. So this is Virus Bulletin, which we've talked about in the past. They used to be kind of a pay service in order to get their reports, which were very good contextual reports, but they've since gone to an open environment, allowing people to kind of see this stuff. This is an older report. They just released it on Virus Bulletin this month, but it's actually a report from September of last year, and it discusses the trends in these DDoS Trojans, mostly kind of focusing in on these embedded devices. So we've been talking a lot over the past few years of these embedded devices getting compromised, having malware put on them, and they engage in scanning, like the 23TCP scanning has been very elevated. I'll give you my insights into that as we talk about what their report is. Things have changed a little bit, I think, and this is just some conjecture of my own, but it's a really good report. I recommend people check it out. It's from the guys at Avast, another AV company, that put this report together. But they talk about a lot of interesting things in more depth than most reporting you get. So they talk about the ELF file format, the different types of architecture like MIPS and ARM, type processors that you can have for the code, the bot builder tools that are used for these different things, so you can build your own malware and how to distribute it, or how the bad guys would distribute it. And then they also talk about the various families. So when you look at this picture here, the purple stuff is all the DDoS Trojans, and then there's some other families, like in blue there are Trojans, and some of the standout ones are like Tsunami, which we run across a lot on these embedded devices that we're seeing compromised. And a smaller, but still maybe the second largest blue bubble is Hydra, which we talk about a lot also known as Light Hydra, which is a toolkit for embedded malware on these embedded type Linux devices. But the purple section is the one that's the DDoS, which is really their focus. And they talk about the various families. One of them that I think is really the standout, and it's not a big bubble on this chart, Elknot, I think, is the largest bubble in the lower left-hand side there, which I suspect is not as large as Lizard Stressor is now. So in some of the stuff that I've been seeing over the past, most of this year and this recent uptick, to me, it looks like a lot of these devices are in the Lizard Stressor, also known as GAFGYT. The reason I think that one's most successful is because of all of these families there. That particular family of malware, when it deploys on the machine, so like they scan, they get into it, they brute force the password, they get in. First thing they do is they try to drop every single type. So they'll drop a 32-bit binary, they'll drop a 64-bit, they'll drop a MIPS, they'll drop an ARM, they'll drop a blah, 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 PPC. And they'll try to execute all of them. Whichever one actually runs properly is the one that takes, and then the thing continues.
And if it crashes the device, they don't care, right?
Right. So it's the most cross-compiled of all of these families, and I think that's why it's been the most successful. Also, the source code was released last year, so it made it a lot more easier for other people to take it, modify it, build their own. Whenever the source code is released, you see these families of malware become a lot more utilized because they don't have to pay for it, So I thought it's an interesting report. They also go over some interesting things about the statistics of the distributions of these and the types of targets that are being targeted. But again, this was a report from last year, so things have changed a little bit. But it's not slowed. It's just kind of changed in shape of how maybe these bubbles would look. I can't recreate it for our own. We don't have enough data. I don't have enough time.
I think the whole rectangle will be filled with one bubble, right?
Yeah, you're probably right. But it is, it's a really interesting report. I think if you're interested in this embedded type of malware, it's a good read, and he goes over a lot of the interesting aspects of it that I think people would find interesting.
All right, very good. Yeah. And we'll be talking a little bit more about the continuing observations around that.
Yeah.
All right, good. Next thing here I thought we'd cover is actually this is some viewer mail from a viewer named Robbie, and he actually pointed out something. First of all, he was having a little trouble with his external hard drive and was doing a little bit of research on what the problem might be. Now, I don't know if this had actually anything to do with the problem that he had, but he discovered that basically some of these drives, they have encryption embedded into the external hard drive, and so he was digging around trying to figure out what might the problem be or how to fix it. It kind of ran across this article about from baldnerd.com, and this is a guy that writes some articles on various topics, and it pointed out I think a significant observation. It's been always, well, not always, but for some time now, one of my little things to help try to recognize that there's sometimes a trade-off between confidentiality and integrity, those two, principles of security, and availability. That is, in order to provide confidentiality and integrity, generally you have to add complexity to the system, which adds points of vulnerability, whereas availability, you want to try to keep it simple and focus on making sure that, traffic gets through as, or the data is, available.
We talked about with the factors of authentication.
Yes.
Having 2 or 3 factors, it's going to slow your access, but it's what you need to make sure you're safe and secure.
Right. Yeah. So it's clearly that's a data access model, very, very much the point. Even in systems, if you want to make it more available, you replicate it many times, put it in many different places, and so that if you lose it in here or there. but it also makes it more accessible, more places to attack. So it's those types of things that you have to take into account. But I think what is perhaps more important to recognize here is you got to ask the question, if you're using encryption, what are you encrypting to protect against? And this is a case where you've got to sort of sit and scratch your head. You've got, this external hard drive that's encrypting the data on the drive, and you can unplug the drive and plug it in somewhere else, and your data is still accessible. What is that encryption
because the
protecting?
firmware controller, right, in between. So when you have a hard drive, it has kind of a controller that hooks into it as part of the unit.
Yeah.
And that's doing the encryption part. So not that I would ever disassemble those, although not to say I haven't in the old days, but most people would not, you know what I mean? Like if a drive's dead, I'm gonna pitch it.
Well, in fact, I think that perhaps may be the case here where he had an availability thing perhaps, is like he wanted to take the drive out of the enclosure, perhaps the enclosure had failed, and plug it in somewhere else and try to get the data, but the enclosure had the key.
Right.
And so once that failed, it basically meant the whole thing had failed. But ultimately, from a security, an attacker's point of view, they're not going to come in there and neatly take your disk drive out. They're going to take the whole thing and
right, and just unplug it.
Right, and so
because
So I think that's one of the things. Even inside a computer, if you have encryption on a computer, they're not going to come in and take your drive out. They're going to take the whole computer and go and use it. So really the lesson here, I just wanted to sort of point out is that, and consistent with the article. Sometimes encryption can provide a false sense of security. You have to really have an understanding of what is being protected, what that encryption is protecting, and how the keys are managed consistent with that protection model. Otherwise, it's perhaps not worth the burden. It would actually be, degrading your potential for availability, which is, in fact, a security attribute to be paying attention to. So next thing we're going to do here is we'll hand it over to you, John Markley, and we have a little bit of a history quiz. Actually,
yep, thank
at least
you.
the first question.
I will mention though in the last story, the baldnerd.com site is not my personal site.
We should thank Robbie, right? Thanks to Robbie for submitting it.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Robbie, for your story.
Keep them coming.
So anyway, so we're going to start off with a hard question here today, and that is the first recognizable, and recognizable is always that key element that we may have to have a debate on. Modern is another one maybe. Operating system was either Multics, Atlas Supervisor, OS 360, or CP/M. And I have to say I've worked on two of the four, and I know the two of the four that I worked on were not the answer.
Okay.
Interesting.
Well, I'm going to walk through this here because, first of all, I'm going to look at B. Atlas Supervisor to me is completely foreign, so I'm going to say that's not recognizable.
That's probably the right answer, but I've never heard of Atlas Supervisor. So
now, Multics I know.
Me too.
And that happened to be, I think, one of the first actually operating systems built from the ground up, intended to be a trusted operating system. And so it was intended to provide, separation, and I don't remember exactly, but I, had levels of security associated with it, and was done, and it was a very impractical one. I don't think it ever had any practical use associated with it. So that basically leaves us with C and D. Now, OS 360 to me is
too new.
Yeah.
Maybe I'm too old, but OS 360, I remember using it on a regular basis when I was an adult.
That was a later generation IBM mainframe operating system, and a rather sophisticated one that stuck around for a decent amount of time. And the next one being CP/M, and I was kind of leaning towards CP/M as well.
I'm leaning towards CP/M.
Being
I have
one
a
of the
CP/M machine still, and I have Zork 1 on 8-inch disc in the original packaging for CP/M.
So, John, I think, Joe, do you have a different opinion here?
I'll go with John Hogaboom on this one.
Not me?
I'll go with my two experts here.
All right, so John Markley, what's the verdict here?
I need a buzzer to go brrr.
We all lose.
You had it guessed right just with the random guess. It's B, Atlas Supervisor.
Oh, you got to be kidding me. So
I figured it was because I never heard of it. It's got to be.
It's recognizable.
It was a British operating system used for, I think, Manchester computers.
Wow.
And so it's the key here is recognizable and modern. So of course, when we talk operating system, we want something that's a little bit more divorced from a particular from a specific set of hardware. So you can't just say it only runs on this piece of hardware. And so you the earliest version of that was the Atlas Supervisor. Then came Multics, I think was second. And then we start walking through the other ones after that. But they've all been around a long time. Atlas Supervisor actually has just, I think in the early or late 90s, early 2000s, finally went away. So it was actually persisted for some time in very limited exposure.
All right. Very good. Okay. So
wait, I got you. I got you with one. All right. So let's see if I get you with two.
all right. So the next one here, terminology. And I think, Joe, you got the lead on this one. So go ahead, John.
All right, so in mobile parlance, so in mobile tech speak, jailbreak and root refer to things like, for example, jailbreak allows unauthorized software. Root is system-level access. B is jailbreak means to allow access to unauthorized users. Root allows access for certain users. C, jailbreak involves changing a loaded app, whereas root means changing a loaded operating system. Or D, the terms are synonymous.
I guess if we go through these from the bottom up, I don't think they're synonymous. I don't think that root means changing a loaded operating system, so I don't think that's it either. B, jailbreak means to allow access to unauthorized users. I think jailbreak is more universal access, so I'm going to go with A on this one. Jailbreak allows unauthorized software, and root is system-level access.
And Joe got one right.
Oh, he did.
We're
get
good.
it. I was going to say that's a little tricky because some
is a
people
little
in the
tricky.
mobile parlance, jailbreak and rooting is sometimes used
They're
similarly.
sometimes used synonymously.
Where they're
but
like, I rooted the
think-
phone,
Well,
but
root
really,
and brick can kind of go.
well, brick? No,
Brick.
bricking is totally different.
Well,
I've
my
bricked many a
impression was-
device.
Yeah.
A lot of people use them to mean the same thing. They say, I'm going to jailbreak, an Android, or I'm going to root this Apple. That's not how it works. I mean, they really mean unauthorized access in general, but it's the specific type of unauthorized access that that gets referred to by either jailbreak or root. So Joe got it right. So jailbreak is just, I'm going to load unauthorized software from a non-standard source, and I've changed the system to allow that, whereas root is letting me have that deep dive. I can even change the operating system if I wanted to.
All right. Very good. So next one here, and we're going to have John Hogaboom, the hardest one.
Well, I'll let him read it off first.
Yeah, go
All
ahead.
right. So the key here is, and I'm actually going to give you a hint because it's not on the slide, it's not on the read, but I'm going to tell you. So John, you may get an out here. So the Juno mission will reach Jupiter on July 4th of this year. And how far will Jupiter be from Earth on this date? And here's the key, or the clue, is this is using satellite with X-band, and it takes 40 minutes to communicate one way with the satellite, or with the Juno.
40 minutes? Is that what you said?
40 minutes.
So what is it? 86,000 miles per second,
Use your watch.
right? Yeah.
So you got four choices. It's either A, 300,000 miles, B, 1 billion. We got to do the little 1 billion miles. C, 50 million miles, or D, 470 million miles.
Yeah. I
So
was going to use some cheater math here.
your cheater math? Well, I'll let you do the cheater math. I'm just going to use the lazy, I don't care enough to do the math. But not to say I don't care enough. But it's not a security thing, so I don't feel bad if I get this wrong. But from playing Kerbal Space Program, which I had mentioned that I play,
Yeah.
I'm going to guess it feels like 470 million miles is about right.
That's a pretty good one. Yeah.
That just feels
know-
like,
I was going to use a very similar or some logic here. 8 minutes for light to get from the sun to Earth. That's 89 million miles. So there you go.
oh, okay. Well, what's the right answer? It's not a billion, I guess, right? So I'm going with D, 470 million miles.
All right. So y'all got 2 out of 3 right. So that's correct.
Very good.
It is 470 million miles. 50 million is actually Mars, if you're just curious.
Okay.
But the interesting thing about this whole space probe communication and whatnot is how it works. If you ever want to dive into the amount of radio spectrum that we transmit into space, it used to be a lot more. We're a lot more focused now than we used to be. But if you actually look at how noisy space is around Earth, we're sending a lot of of signals out of the atmosphere,
Yep.
and so it's kind of interesting how they actually communicate with these missions.
Yeah, it is. I couldn't help but notice or think about what the tides would be like if Jupiter were 300,000 miles away from the Earth.
Yes. I don't think we'd have any water left on the planet. I think we get ripped apart.
I think
probably.
Jupiter would take all our water, yes. So, all right, so let's move on here. Thank you, John, for putting that quiz together for us. It's always an entertaining segment. Next thing here is a colleague of ours identified basically, I think he picked this up on Twitter feed from some activity that was going on. But nevertheless, recently a vulnerability has been identified associated with CLAM antivirus software. Now, if you're not already familiar, CLAM antivirus is an open source antivirus tool that is designed more specifically for Unix platforms, which is relatively unusual for Unix platforms to have antivirus on it. But there are applications where that is a valuable capability to have in place. So having a vulnerability associated with that would be obviously something you want to be concerned about. And there was some discussion about having some scanning activity taking place to see how many of these devices were out there. And so the first item in the Internet Weather Report is actually associated with port 3310 TCP. And it's not officially associated with CLAM antivirus, but that certainly is a port that it uses. And there is some scanning activity going on. Near as we can tell, this is all sort of researcher activity. There isn't any malicious intent behind this, but we can expect that there are probably some of those types of activities that may follow in the future. So looking at the top 10 most probed ports, at the top of the list, port 23, followed by 53413 UDP. Of course, 23 being Telnet. 53413 UDP is a backdoor associated with NetIS routers, followed by port 80 TCP and then 22 TCP. 3389, that's remote desktop protocol. 445 TCP, still that config up stuff out there. 53 UDP, which is associated with DNS and likely scanning to look for DNS servers that can be used as reflectors in denial of service attacks. 1433, that's Microsoft SQL database, and then 1911 TCP. This one really popped up a lot of positions, 389 positions, relatively speaking, and we'll take a quick look at that, but it turns out that is, again, research activity, innocuous. And then the next one, port 123 UDP, that activity is likely associated with identifying, first of all, the way that network time protocol works. Some of the activity is actually associated with legitimate time servers, but some of that is also associated with scanners looking for time servers that can be used for reflective denial of service attacks. So looking at the scan probes on port 1911 a little more closely, you can see here there were some really defined and periodic scanning activities. It looks like there was a little bit of a space in the last week or so, but nevertheless, this is associated with a known researcher organization that, to our knowledge, has no malicious intent. Now, there are some little spikes here and there that show up in between, and so while they're not significant in nature, that is in terms of very aggressive scanning activities, they may in fact be looking for this. Now, port 1911 is associated with an industrial control system or a protocol used in industrial control systems, so it's one that's obviously that folks are going to be sensitive about in the manufacturing or industrial world.
Niagara Tritium Fox is the protocol.
Yeah, thank you. Looking at the top 10 most sources doing the probing, and again, at the top of the list here, and actually overwhelmingly, port 23 has well more than 50% of it. I'm going to say maybe almost 70% of the circle here, followed by 53413 UDP, and then a few other 445, 80 TCP, and then 22 TCP with some UDP and ICMP in between. Not a lot of movement there, but looking at port 23 TCP, both on the top graph showing the number of probes and the bottom graph showing the number of sources doing that probing activity, we still have a significant number of sources, up on the order of about 250,000 sources perhaps scanning on an hourly basis. So I guess it's dropped down to maybe about 200,000 sources. But that's still, obviously a very significant number and relatively stable. Whereas the number of probes has gone down a little bit, so that they're acting a little more quietly. that is a possibility that these devices are, busy doing other activities, maybe denial of service attacks or some other activity that's slowing them down, and could be a reason that the scanning activity isn't as prominent. So nevertheless, there are an awful lot of devices out there that are infected with this botnet malware. Perhaps a good portion of it.
Lizard stressor.
Yep.
That family we talked about. I don't know what proportion of that,
Yes. We often talk
sure
about
there
the
are.
denial of service attack activity, but that doesn't mean that these devices couldn't be used for other purposes.
Oh yeah, you could use them
They're
for
poking
whatever.
holes
Bitcoin
through
mining,
firewalls.
whatever you
Yep.
want to do on them. Really, it's like a Linux machine. You could do whatever you want.
Yeah. And also scan probes on port 22 TCP. Now, this is actually a number of sources probing on port 22 TCP. And over the last week or so, we have seen basically a doubling of the number of sources, somewhere between 2,000 and 2,600 or so sources in a given hour. And it's a little bit spiky, but I think some of those spikes are actually associated with research activities, whereas the more steady activity likely associated with the botnets that are out there. So nevertheless, port 22 is being targeted. Oftentimes this is, again, brute force password guessing activities against devices. And I just thought it'd be useful to take a look at a geographic distribution. I don't think there's anything really notable about this distribution, perhaps a little heavier density in China, and it looks like perhaps south of China there. And in Europe, but generally speaking, it looks like the populated areas have the most infections. Surprise, surprise. And then looking at port 53413, this is again looking at the number of sources that are doing the scanning activity. This is a case where it's a backdoor in the NetIS routers. They basically encapsulate the script that they want those routers to execute in a packet, toss it out there. The number of sources has gone up significantly over the last week or so here, perhaps doubling over the last 2 weeks. From, say, 20,000 sources, we're up around 60, so it's tripled actually over the last couple of weeks to around 60,000 sources. This is one of the highest levels that we've seen on this port as well, so perhaps even associated with some of the same
This
botnets.
vulnerability's been out for a while. Is
Yeah.
it surprising that it hasn't been further addressed by the vendor?
Well, this is a case where these devices are sold with no real patch management strategy or process around that. Most people install them in their homes, and so long as it's working, they just forget that it's there, and patch management is almost
Whereas others will
non-existent.
dial home for upgrades.
Some of the newer devices are, in fact, dialing home for upgrades. In fact, I'm glad you pointed this out. If you go out to buy a device, I think that's one of the fundamental things you look for, is that it has automatic updates associated with it.
Yeah.
And in fact, I was just shopping for a device recently. I'm not going to mention brand names because I'm not here to promote things, but that is something you want to look for, is that it does automatic updates.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And then, considering we're talking about all the scanning activity, I thought it would be useful to take a look at how much of the activity on the network is actually probing activity. So this is, based on our vantage point, but taking a relative measurement, that is, for each connection attempt that takes place, how many of them are associated with scanning activity? And over the last, several months, we're hovering around between 6% and 8%, and then just over the last couple of weeks here, because of the significant increase in probing on port 23, in particular, port 22 and the 53413, we've seen that spike up to as high as almost 12% of the activity on the internet is actually associated with probing activities. Now, this is combined with all the other ports that are involved in that activity as well, so it's not just those handful. And that's our show for today. We'd like to thank you for joining us, and if you'd like to get in touch with us, you can email us at attthreattrack@list.att.com. And once again, thank you, Robbie, for your email. It turned out to be a very good story, in my opinion. And you can find AT&T Threat Track on the AT&T Tech channel. It's on YouTube, as well as an audio podcast on iTunes. You can follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @ATTBusiness. And I'd like to thank you, John Markley, for joining us today. Thanks, John Hogeboom. Thank you, Joe Harton. I'm Brian Rixrode. We'll be back next week with a new episode. And until then, keep your network safe.